Stephen Wilson was born in Mercer County, Kentucky, and received all his college degrees from the University of Kentucky. He has taught college history classes at various colleges and universities, including the University of Kentucky, Lexington Baptist College, Hazard Community College, West Kentucky Community College, Mid-Continent University, and 14 years at Alice Lee College. An author or co-author of 3 books and over 30 articles. He is currently the Director of Academic Affairs at Campbellsville University in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Steve Wilson.
Trying to locate my timekeeper. And I should say that sometimes I get inspired by my own words. I mean, you won't be, but sometimes I do. And so I need a timekeeper. Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay, thank you. You know, I was 14 years a teacher of Alice Lloyd College students. And in all that time, I never had an Alice Lloyd College student that ever disappointed me until today at lunch. So anyway, but we're working on her and seeing what we can do to try to make her life a little better. I need to also correct my talk today. You cannot do a discussion of the Constitution in 50 minutes. So today's address is called Highlights of the Constitution, because that's what I'm going to talk about. I cannot possibly talk about all of this in 50 minutes. Well, let's begin to do that. The Constitution was devised in 1787 to replace our first Constitution, which was called the Articles of Confederation. That is a long talk to explain why that did not work out. But the short version is it was simply too weak of a government for the founding fathers. And so they elected to have a constitutional convention and come up with this. Let me tell you something about this. It was designed to kind of be very permanent. There have only been 27 changes in our Constitution. Those are the amendments that we have, 27 times. In all that time, if you're an Alice Lloyd College student, and I know we have some adult students, if you were an Alice Lloyd College student that was alive in 1992, raise your hand. You're not an Alice Lloyd College student.
That's not now, no.
All right. Believe it or not, that was the last time that we passed an amendment. We've only had 2 of them in my lifetime. But imagine that. We have never made a change to our Constitution since 1992. By the way, in case you're curious, the amendment was if congressmen gave themselves a raise, it wouldn't go into an effect until they had had an election. So that was the last amendment. That's the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, let me give you the federal government. Only the federal Congress can do that. And so the Supreme Court ruled, you know, you can't do that. However, and by the way, for the record, I would like to see some financial aid relief. But in order to do that, Congress has to pass it. And that'll enable my wife to pay off her last $10,000 of her federal aid. So that's one thing. There's 2 things they do. They raise revenues and they dispense with revenues. Also, they make new laws. This is the branch of government that makes new laws. Now, you wouldn't know that from our presidential campaigns, because every presidential campaign says, well, if I become president, I'm going to do this. Actually, constitutionally, a president can only enforce the law. He has only 2 duties in relation to laws. He can't make laws. That is Congress, the legislative branch. What he can do is when they bring him a bill, he has 3 options. He can sign it and make it a law. He can veto it and say, no, I forbid it. But, as you know, Congress can pass it over his veto with a 2/3 majority. Or, and this happens, or he can just not do anything. And after a number of days, it becomes law without his signature. So that is what it can do with the law. By the way, a second thing that a president can do is he can advise the Congress from time to time with a State of the Union message. It used to be written out, where he could say, these are some things I'd like to see you do. But in recent decades, that has been an actual address where he will do that. It's a big deal. Actually, the early presidents all just wrote it down and sent it as a letter to the legislative branch for them to read. Also, the legislature can borrow money. We cannot operate our government today without borrowing money. Only this branch can do that. They create post offices and roads. By the way, I love government services. I came here in part on federal roads, a lot of state roads too. And Congress is the one that can pass that. Only Congress can authorize that. Again, notice the pattern. The making of new things, of laws, things like roads, things like gathering money or dispensing it, is only something the legislative branch can do. They maintain the Army and Navy. That is done by Congress. They declare wars. A president might be a commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare wars. Was anybody alive here at the last time we declared a war? Be careful, this is a trick question. All right, believe it or not, our last declared war was World War II, a long time ago. We have conducted wars, but we have never said these were official wars. We say they are police actions. So the last time we've had Congress has only voted 6 wars in our history. World War II was the last one that they did. Also, they determine the value of money is done by the federal Congress. And these are just some of the highlights that the federal Congress does. The next branch of government is the executive branch. Its primary duty is to enforce the law. Congress will pass it. That is what he does. He enforces the law. And he has to make decisions about, of course, what laws that he has to enforce. We actually, by now, have thousands of these. And it's just, we can't even enforce all the laws we have. So a president has to make a choice about what he will enforce and what he will not enforce. We'll talk a little bit about that under another category in a moment. In wartime, he's the commander-in-chief. He cannot declare war on his own. He is the commander-in-chief during a war. With the War Powers Act that we passed in the 70s, it is true that the president can initiate a police action. But after a while, he has to come back to Congress for approval. And the reason why that was passed is we live in a nuclear age. Sometimes a decision has to be made quickly, and the president is authorized to do kind of emergency kinds of conflicts, but in the end, he has to have the approval of Congress. He can make treaties. Now, a branch of Congress, the U.S. Senate, has to approve of those treaties. But the president can make a treaty on his own, and later the Senate must approve of that. He can grant pardons. The last few presidents have made a lot of pardons that were kind of controversial, but that is a power that we give to the President of the United States, as he can grant pardons. Next, he can give, of course, that State of the Union message. It used to be written out, but today, of course, he actually goes to Congress and did that. That is not something that Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or any of the early presidents did. They just wrote a letter. George Washington, our first president, just wrote out his State of the Union message and sent it to Congress for it to be read. The last branch of government is the judicial branch. It is headed by the Supreme Court. The Constitution allows Congress to pass other courts beneath it, but this is the ultimate law of the land, and they interpret the law. For instance, they can rule on acts of the president and laws that Congress passes. In other words, even if Congress passes a law and the president signs it, one more step is, if challenged, the Supreme Court can rule on whether or not that actually becomes a law. So interpreting the law of the Supreme Court is very important. They also can act on decisions of the federal bureaucracy and the states and even private individuals. A private individual can actually take a case that can go all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is what they can do. These are a brief account of the three branches of government, but there's a lot more to discuss. For instance, what does the Constitution say about the role of religion? Three parts of the Constitution address this. First of all, I'll get my glasses for this one. At the very end of the Constitution, it's very interesting. They were talking about how they organized this, and it has this quotation here. This was done by the convention by the unanimous consent of the states present on the 17th day of September in the year of our Lord, 1787. In other words, they evoked the Almighty at the very end of the Constitution. And in other words, they had a Christian worldview. But this is what is interesting. Even though they lived at a time that had a Christian worldview, they chose to have what will later be called, it wasn't called in this document, a separation of church and state. Because at the very end of that, it also says this. They must support the Constitution, as talked about the officers of the government, but no religious test shall ever be required as qualification for any office or public trust under the United States. In other words, right from the very beginning, they would not have to prescribe to some kind of faith-based statement. That is actually forbidden. You don't have to take a religious oath. A third part of the Constitution, of course, is in that First Amendment addressing the role of religion. And it's very specific. The First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, the United States, right from the very beginning, elected not to go the way of Europe and have a state church. Didn't want to do it. No state church. And in fact, they did not even give any precedent or protection to any one religion. Remember what it reads. Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But it also contains this, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, an interesting compromise. No state church, but yet the state is not going to interfere with your private religion. And so, very interesting. I love this discussion because it often talks about our founding fathers being such great heroes, to be that open-minded. But actually, I think there was a very practical reason for that First Amendment. And here it is. No one religion had a majority of the people. Not a single one. And they would have gotten in trouble if they'd said, well, we're going to have the Episcopal Church to be our state church, or the Presbyterian Church, or the Baptist. And not a single denomination had a majority of the nation's people. So they decided that they would be completely neutral as far as the establishment of religion. All would be recognized, and interestingly enough, there would be no state church, but at the same time, they would guarantee the rights of people to worship freely. When the Supreme Court issued its 1963 ruling about no prayer in public school, I used to teach history at this very place, and I always scoffed at that. I laughed at that. And I said, here we go. There will always be prayer in the schools as long as they give tests. So if they give a test, you'll see prayers. I taught at the University of Kentucky, and I would give a test, and I would see kids in my class praying at the University of Kentucky. Oh my gosh, Dr. Wilson's history test. And so, and that is completely allowed. It's an individual effort by that person. So that's kind of interesting what they did about the role of religion. Europe was shocked that we did not have a state church. At that time in Europe, every state had, every country had a state church. We elected not to do that. Next, I want to talk about those 27 changes that we call the amendments, beginning with the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is very important. I'm going to read it in its entirety. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. A lot of individual rights are in that First Amendment. Now, I got to tell you something incredible. In 1787, we didn't have that. And a group of the founding fathers who called themselves anti-federalists said, well, wait a minute. There's no Bill of Rights. You're not guaranteeing any freedoms to the people. James Madison, who we call the father of the Constitution, he said, well, wait a minute. He goes, I'll tell you what, we'll work on that. We'll work on that. We'll come up with some ideas. If you will approve this the way it is, we can add those protections later. And 2 years later, they did. They added 10, they proposed 12, but only 10 of them got through, including all those First Amendment guarantees. Imagine that the American people trusted a politician. I don't usually poll students, but I'm dying to do it. Would you trust your politicians to tell you, if you'll do this, if you'll be patient with me, I'll do this in 2 years? Raise your hand if you have that much trust for your politicians. Alice Lloyd College students, you're a cynical bunch. By the way, I noticed none of the adults raised their hand either. That is why you got to admire somebody like Madison who could deliver on a promise like that, and he delivered. There was a time when we actually had leaders that people really trusted. By the way, don't feel bad about not raising your hand, because I wouldn't have done it either. I would not have done it either. I wish we had a lot of people in public office that we could really trust. But they added the first 10 amendments that we call the Bill of Rights. Now, this is what I've got to also tell you. None of those are ironclad. Remember, we had this thing called the Supreme Court. And you know what? By the way, going back to this thing about religion, we're still arguing over that. What does the First Amendment mean? None of these are ironclad. For instance, freedom of speech. Courts have said, quite rightly, that you can't always have freedom of speech. There are things that you can say that are going to cause you problems. For instance, you cannot use your speech to start a riot. or an insurrection. If you make a speech to that, that is not something that's constitutionally protected. By the way, you cannot slander someone publicly. I see one of my good friends in the front row, Cindy Sammons, and you know what? If I want to talk about her, I'm going to make sure I don't do it in a public forum like this. Because if I cite her by name publicly, you can sue me for slander. So, if y'all will gather with me sometime after this, privately, I will tell you some dirt on her. Okay, that's privately. Now, that's just going to be between me and about 100 of you. But I wouldn't do that in a public forum, in a microphone, because that is not protected speech. Another thing you can't do is you can't rival someone in print. If you put it in print, it better be true. Good example was just a few years ago. One of these gossip magazines published a story about Nicole Kidman saying that she had started an affair while she was still married to Tom Cruise. And Nicole Kidman said, y'all know Nicole Kidman, she's an actress. She was horrified with this. She goes, I most certainly did not. I didn't start any romance until after our marriage was over with. And she got so mad that she sued 2 publications in England for this. Is that me? I just violated something that I don't allow my students to do. Sorry about that. I apologize. All of you can get 3 points in whatever class you're in. All right, so tell your teachers that you've been awarded 3 extra credit points because that I did that. Anyway, Nicole Kidman did this. She sued 2 publications. Courts agreed with her. And lo and behold, she collected $1.5 million, which she donated it to charity. She donated it to charity. She did not want to take to benefit from that. She wanted to make sure that, manufacture some saliva here. She wanted to make sure that her reputation was protected. Next, you can petition the government. You have that right, but again, you can't petition the government for things that would be illegal. So as you can see, this amendment, the courts have determined they're not ironclad. You can't always speak, you can't always petition, you can't always put something in print. There are, of course, things that you could suffer the consequences for. The Second Amendment is next. What does it say? A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Believe it or not, we're still debating what that means. In the 1930s, the U.S. Supreme Court said that right is only guaranteed to the people if they're part of the militia, the National Guard. But it was never enforced because already there had been a long tradition of people having the right to have firearms. By the way, for the record, I own 2 of them. And that's what the Supreme Court said in the 1930s. But not too long ago, the Supreme Court said, actually, there is a right to bear arms for an individual, irrespective of their time in the militia. So, we're still debating about what to do with guns, what to do with the Second Amendment. But for those of you that have a concern about heavily restricting or even abolishing guns, you got your work cut out for you. There are in America 100 million gun owners. They own 3 million firearms. In other words, the average gun owner owns 3, one more than what I have. And they own 1 trillion rounds of ammunition. Wow. They outgun all of the nation's police forces and armed forces, private citizens do. What do we do about guns? A big debate about that. Second Amendment at the moment, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, says there is an individual right to have one. And by the way, they struck down city laws in Chicago and New York City that said you couldn't have a handgun. And so that right as an individual is now enshrined and protected. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, there are a lot of people that I wish didn't have a gun. By the way, in case you're curious, most of the firearm deaths are not mass shootings. They are suicides. That's the largest category of guns taking people's lives are suicides. The last year I saw for 65%. And so there is a continuing debate about what the Second Amendment is. By the way, let me tell you something, not to get off on a sidebar, because I want to address it a little later in my address. But the federal government is lousy at trying to ban or regulate products and services. They're just not good at it. One of these later amendments was the 18th Amendment, outlawing alcohol. It was a disaster. It was a disaster because organized crime got its start from getting around prohibition laws. And eventually we had to pass another amendment, the 21st Amendment, to allow people to be able to drink. It was left to the states to decide. Mississippi in 1962 was the last state to repeal its ban on alcoholic beverages. You name the service or the product, the federal government is just not good at it under this Constitution. Because if millions of people want to do something, they'll do it, regardless of whether there is a law or not. I'll come back to this later. Other amendments that are interesting, the 8th Amendment, which protects you against cruel and unusual punishment. What has changed, however, is a debate about what's cruel and unusual. At the moment, about half of our states have outlawed capital punishment out of a feeling that that is now thought by many to be a cruel and unusual punishment. But there was a time when every state in the Union had capital punishment. Today, only about half do, because in many people's minds, even capital punishment is a cruel and unusual punishment. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, which is interesting because again, I'm going to point out Mrs. Salmon, she was also one of my students here. And in that day when I had her in the early 90s or late 80s, all right, at that time, we talked about things like slavery and piracy being something of the past. But in recent years, they've made quite a comeback. And even here in the United States, in spite of that 13th Amendment, we have people held in some kind of bondage against their will. By the way, when the Americans and British stopped patrolling a lot of the seas and they downsized their navies, piracy revived again. It's kind of interesting. Things that we thought we got rid of have come back to us. So anyway, on the amendments, we've had a number of them over the years, but only 27 amendments, 27 changes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we interpret the Constitution. When the United States was founded, there was 3 guys that wrote a lot of works about their hopes for the Constitution. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. That was eventually published in a big book about that thick called the Federalist Papers. And they were arguing about what type of government the United States should have. And in the end, they decided kind of a compromise between a monarchy one-man rule, and a complete democracy. There was a thought that both of those were bad, particularly Alexander Hamilton. He feared, in his view, democracy was mob rule. So therefore, they defined the new government. And I got to find it here so I can read it. It's in the 4th article. Again, let me read this. The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, which means the country was set up as a republic. But the word republic is kind of interesting. It only means you're going to have a country without a monarchy, without a divine right monarch. In other words, even a dictatorship or an oligarchy or a military rule can call itself a republic, as many of those did. It's simply a country without a king. And there's no doubt about it, the original United States Constitution was certainly not a democracy. The president was not elected by the people. The U.S. Senate was determined not by a vote of the people, but by each state legislature. And they made the amending process very, very hard to do, to make sure there wouldn't be a lot of changes. In order to have 27 amendments, it's got to pass by a 2/3 vote in the House, a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and 3/4 of the states have to agree to it. That's why we have only 27 of these amendments. We proposed all kinds of other amendments, but only 27 made it through that process. In other words, it was kind of designed that it would be hard to change this. So we were set up as a republic. But for those of you that have your own theories about government, I got to tell you, that's what we started out as. But we have had a trend toward democracy. No doubt about it. For instance, we eventually decided by an amendment that people can elect their senators in their states. And we also increased the franchise. In 1787, the only people that had the right to vote were white, property-owning males. Minorities did not vote. Slaves did not vote. Women did not vote, or young people could not vote. You had to be 21. If you're 21, this is for the students and the Salmons. If you're 21, raise your hand. Wow. Most of you in this audience could not have voted under the original Constitution. But over time, we enfranchised every one of those groups. African Americans by the 15th Amendment, women by the 19th Amendment. My grandmother lived most of her life as a non-voting person. She wasn't a citizen. That meant she couldn't serve in juries, she couldn't vote. And by the way, I'm 71, so that's why I have a grandmother who was living most of her life before 1920. And in the 26th Amendment, we allowed 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds to vote. And that was an interesting amendment. We were sending 18-year-olds to Vietnam. And the feeling was, we'll let them die for the country, but they can't vote. So they passed the 26th Amendment during my lifetime to allow people who were 18, 19, and 20-year-olds to vote. So the movement is toward democracy. But we still have vestiges of the old idea about fears of a true democracy. For instance, we do not elect the president. If you have elected a president, raise your hand. Another trick question. None of you raised your hand. The reason why, you've never actually voted for a president directly. That is done by the Electoral College, by the states, And they're not necessarily bound by even the candidate they're supposed to represent. During my lifetime, a lot of federal electors have voted for other people. It was the spring of 1970. I was 18 years old in my college, not my college, my high school speech class, which I took during my senior year. And I gave a speech, my first public speech, that we should abolish the Electoral College and directly elect the president. And I said that in 1970, 53 years ago. And guess what? We still are not doing that. We still allow the Electoral College to elect our president 53 years after I gave my first public speech on wanting to abolish the Electoral College. By the way, the winner of the popular vote does not always become president. In 2016 and in the year 2000, men became president who did not win the popular vote. The candidate that got the most electoral votes became president. So as you can see, that's one thing in our movement toward democracy that we've still left unaddressed. By the way, another issue that we've left unaddressed is the Constitution says that each house of the legislature can determine their own rules of order. The U.S. Senate has a rule that in order to stop debate, you have to have 60 votes. Because of that rule, a lot of laws are not being passed by a majority. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. That is what the operating rules are. But it's interesting that you can actually have laws that most people would favor, but simply the rules of the Senate can prevent. And of course, the obvious, it is just simply very hard to amend this. But ultimately, we are responsible for that. We have decided that, you know what, we like the amending process. And until we change the rules, a lot of those vestiges of a time when we were we were weary about having democracy are still in place. And finally, in my last 5 minutes, I want to talk about how to interpret the Constitution. There are two very broad ways of looking at interpreting this. One is, it says you should interpret the Constitution through strict constructionism. This is the idea that you only interpret the Constitution as the original founding fathers would have envisioned. Now, the original founding fathers lived in a society where the U.S. Census revealed, our first U.S. Census was 1790. 90% of us lived on farms. We were a nation of farmers. Only 10% of our people had occupations besides farming. And we only had 2 million citizens. So it was an agricultural society, pre-industrial. Not a whole lot of people were college educated, a very different society. But nevertheless, there is a thought that when you interpret the Constitution, you should only interpret it by strict constructionism, thinking about only how the founding fathers envisioned it. Another philosophy is called a living constitution. It's the idea that as time goes on, you can make changes to the Constitution as needed by contemporary events. For the most part, I've got to be careful, for the most part, I agree with that view. It's a good idea to kind of make sure that you are really paying attention to what the needs of the people are. Now, not in every case, I should add. I'm giving my personal opinion on this. But the living constitution idea is the idea that you can make changes in our Constitution as time goes on. But as I've said, I led with this. We've only made 27 changes in our Constitution. By the way, I don't know if I have time. How much time? 3 minutes. All right, real quick. One thing that this Constitution is lousy at doing is what I mentioned a while ago, products and services. What do we do with products and services that people don't like or that people do like? I can give a long list of products and services that we just have not got a handle on. Well, one is guns, liquor, drugs, pornography, abortions, these products and services. The federal government has just, under this Constitution, has not done a good job in trying to ban or heavily regulate products or services. And I'll tell you why. If enough people want to do it, they are largely going to do it. I have a good friend who's a strong Second Amendment person. He's afraid that the government is going to outlaw guns. So I tell him, I said, there's 100 million of us out there. I'm one of them, you're one of them. He has 17 guns, I only have 2. And I said, if they banned it tomorrow, there would be enterprising organizations and people that would make guns. My cousin, before he passed away, made his own guns. The federal government just has not done a very good job of regulating products and services. Believe me, there's a lot of them that I would want to see heavily regulated. But if enough people want to do it, they're going to do it. Remember the war on drugs? Hadn't gone very well. And alcohol, under this Constitution, we just can't do a good job of regulating products and services. Privately, I'll give you my opinion on that, but not publicly. We just can't seem to get a handle on what do we do with products and services. This Constitution has set up a government that has largely failed at having a reasonable way to address what we do with products and services. That is the end of my address.